Welcome to Fishy Work, a podcast on ecologies, labour and fish governance. This episode, we're speaking with Miriam Wilhelm and Andrew Crane about intervening in the supply chain. If I tell you that this episode is about supply chain management, then will you promise not to switch off the podcast? I know that none of those words sounds amazingly exciting, especially in combination, but as I came to realise in the course of making this episode, thinking about how a supply chain is managed is, in fact, one way of putting people and the things they make and that we consume front and centre of our discussion, whilst also thinking about how everything all fits together. When we talk about abstract things like global flows of capital and goods, it's often, at least to my mind, hard to always grasp where people fit into it. Or if I'm to come to that from another angle, if I were to give you a rich account of everyday work on a fishing boat, then, especially if it's not done very well, it might be hard to make the connection between the stuff that ends up on our supermarket shelves and the everyday working lives of those on fishing vessels. Now, thinking of supply chains can, as I hope you'll realise in the course of our upcoming conversation, also allow for a greater understanding of how to intervene in ways that improve the labour conditions of fisherfolk. And we have two amazing guests to guide us in our understanding of this topic. Miriam Wilhelm, Professor of Sustainable Supply Chain Management at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and Andrew Crane, Professor of Business and Society at the University of Bath. We're going to start off talking about the now almost decade-old modern slavery scandal in Thailand's fishing industry, including what's changed today, before moving on to discuss in detail the successes and failures of NGOs and civil society groups who have attempted to intervene in the supply chain as they try to end forced labour and improve working conditions more generally. There's a link to Miriam and Andrew's work in the show notes, and you'll also find them on the website. And as you'll hear during the discussion, Andrew could tell I'd read their work pretty closely, and so I can confidently recommend their research to you all. We also make reference to the ILO, which is the International Labour Organization, and I always want to make sure we're on the same page with acronyms because personally I think there's far too many of them in the world. And as always, at the end of the discussion, please do stick around for our Not in the Net, Alin Kadvak, who's going to tell us what we've just learned and why it's important. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Miriam and Andrew to Fishy Work. How are you doing, Miriam?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, Ian.
Great. And to you too, Andrew, how are things today?
Very good, thanks, Ian. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So I was thinking back in preparation for today's talk to around 8, 9, 10 years ago when I remember reading about a scandal in the fishing industry. There was a lot of reporting at the time about the use of forced labour in Thailand seafood production. And I think like most people who are not directly invested in the topic and, it didn't affect me directly, I sort of read it, thought it was terrible, and then forgot about it. So I was trying to remember what it was at the time and doing a bit of digging around. But I thought a really good way to kick off our discussion, and I'll turn to you first, Miriam, is to ask whether the scandal led to any changes within the industry.
So, that's a very difficult question actually to start the conversation. But there were a lot of important changes. So the scandal was huge, first of all, right? The New York Times wrote about it. The Guardian wrote about it. I think almost any newspaper around the world wrote about it. So it created a huge pressure for the Thai government to respond to the scandal. There were also political pressures in addition. So the United States downgraded Thailand in its trafficking in person report. The European Union issued a yellow card, which was a threat of an import ban of seafood products from Thailand. So the Thai government really had to respond. And what they did is they ratified the ILO Working Fishing Convention. And in fact, Thailand was the first country in Asia to do so. And connected to this, there were a lot of changes in Thailand's fishery reform and labor reform. So you could say that a lot of things did improve. And that's also what the ILO report showed. So the ILO did a couple of surveys at different points in time with fishermen in Thailand, and it showed that there were actually improvements. But a lot of these improvements were on a more superficial level. And I think one thing that didn't improve were freedom of associations and fundamentally strengthening workers' rights for fishers in Thailand. And one of the issues that remained is that migrant workers in Thailand, and migrant workers are a huge share of the population, in fishers' population in Thailand, they are not able to form or lead unions. And I think that's something that didn't change.
Mm-hmm. And is there something specific about the seafood industry that leads to forced labor being so prevalent within it?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, I think seafood has the characteristics of a lot of other sectors, and I think Andy can probably add to that, but a lot of the characteristics that lead to forced labor or increase the risk of forced labor are also present in Thailand. So fishing, first of all, is considered dangerous and dirty work. It's work that a lot of Thai people don't want to do. And thus, a lot of migrant workers end up working in fishing. They might come to Thailand wanting to work in other sectors. They might not dream of a work in fishing, but that's a sector that they often end up in. And that's because it is easier for them to work on a vessel, even if they are undocumented, even if they don't have a legal permit to work. It is easier to evade monitoring when working on a fishing vessels. Fishing vessels are out of the sea for a long period of time, so it's very difficult for labor inspectorates to control, of course, what's going on vessels, but also who is going on a vessel and who's returning on a vessel.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And maybe this is a bit of an abstract question, but I was thinking about this in terms of many other scandals. And that's sort of what I was thinking with my first question as well, is like, as a concerned member of the public, you know, a scandal a week is almost part of our sort of news consumption cycle. And when I think about even these massive, massive scandals, you know, like around Me Too in Hollywood, etc., and so on, then every now and again you'll find these follow-up reports where it's like, actually things are still pretty bad, you know? And I was wondering whether there's something about the logic of scandal and response which stops any real structural change from taking place. And it's questions to both of you.
So one thing you have to give credit to the Thai government is that they made really a lot of changes in a very short amount of time. So the ratification of the ILO Work and Fishing Convention that I mentioned earlier, that was pushed through in a very short time period. So this is, of course, a response to the scandals. So in a way, of course, these scandals are effective. The media attention and the public attention was effective. Also considering that the EU, the European Union, wasn't even such an important market for Thailand. But I think the Thai government, which at the time was also military government, by the way, was very concerned about its international reputation. So I think that in that regard, the scandal was effective. But where the scandal failed, I think, where the pressure failed was to really fundamentally strengthen civil society, to fundamentally strengthen workers' rights in Thailand, because this was something that the Thai government didn't want it to do. And scandals are always effective. The moment everybody's looking, then all the work is being done. But what also happened, and I guess that's the anatomy of a scandal, is once the attention moved to other country, and it did, right? I mean, the attention now is much more on Vietnam. It's much more on China. And it's less on Thailand now. And what just happened earlier this year is that the Thai government actually proposed a number of rollbacks on some of the reforms that they made earlier.
I think another thing that's an aspect here, which I'm not sure if it's scandal specific, Ian, but with a problem like forced labor in a context like Thai fishing, it's a systemic problem, right? It's based on some underlying conditions which are about the kind of vulnerability of workers, the nature of the work, of the industry, you know, all these kind of underlying factors. And so when a scandal happens, the immediate reaction is really to often tackle some of the symptoms of the problem rather than the kind of underlying causes. And so you can show that you're doing something, and lots of companies started investing in more kind of surveillance type of technologies to examine whether there was forced labor happening in their supply chains, to show that they're doing something, that they're checking, but not actually stopping the problem from occurring in the first place, which are some of the things that Miriam was talking about, right? These kind of migration corridors that are already in place between very poor countries in Southeast Asia and Thailand, the inherent vulnerability of many of these workers who are coming from Myanmar and places like that, where they're already under the control of traffickers who bring them into the country, and so they're already indebted. These kind of problems need tackling at the root causes. And so scandals don't always highlight these more systemic kind of causes. And so they focus on what you can do now, what you can do in the face of it, on what you can do to solve the problems right now. But these deeper fundamental causes often get overlooked.
I want to come in the final part of our conversation to talk about some of the initiatives or attempts to try and address these structural systemic problems within the industry. But before we get there, I always think it's interesting for listeners, especially listeners who aren't involved in academia, lucky them, to know a little bit more about the people doing the research. Because as far as I understand it, neither of you two are experts in fisheries per se, as in that wasn't your passion as researchers. So I'm wondering, my question has really two parts. It's like, why did you get into this topic? And then once you're interested, how do you go about researching it?
Yeah, so maybe I can start with answering this question. So my background is I'm a supply chain management scholar. So I have been studying sustainability and supply chains for a number of years now. I started in garment. I have been looking at consumer electronics in China. So I've been looking at different sectors, mainly in the more traditional manufacturing sector. So factories that are in China or in Bangladesh or elsewhere. And I've been looking at how labor standards were implemented or the obstacles to implementing labor standards in these factories. So for me, I was interested in fishing because it seems like a particularly challenging section from a supply chain traceability perspective. I think it is nearly impossible to trace a fish from a particular catch on a vessel to the supermarket, to the retailer, even though standards, some certifications kind of assume that you can do it. It's possible for some of the catch, but there is always a high risk that there are also illegal activities, or it doesn't even need to be illegal, but I think it's very, very difficult to trace the catch back to the retailer. And that's because of the nature of fishing. It is not location bound. So vessels, they move with the fish stocks. And as fish stocks get scarcer, vessels also need to venture out further in the ocean. They spend a longer time out on the ocean. That's the problem I mentioned earlier. It's causing a lot of problems of monitoring. And so it's a particularly murky and non-transparent industry, you could say, or supply chain, you could say. And that I think made it for me very challenging to research this particular topic in this setting.
Yeah, and I think for me, and I've been, like Miriam, I'm a kind of business school researcher, and my expertise has been around business and modern slavery more generally. And in that context, over the last 10, 12 years, I've been looking at different industries, different countries, including the construction and agriculture industry in the UK. We've been looking at the textile industry in India, in the wine industry in Brazil, a range of different contexts. And so this one, it's always interesting to look at these different industries and different countries and see which dynamics are shared across them and which ones vary. And so looking at fishing in Thailand became an interesting aspect of that, interesting node in that kind of network of research projects. And also I've been doing a lot of research for many, many years on the kind of relationships between business and non-profit organizations and the partnerships that businesses engage with NGOs. And in this particular project, that's what the main focus was, on how companies were working with NGOs in trying to tackle these issues. And in the project, we frame them as social intermediaries in supply chains. So rather than thinking about a supply chain as a set of companies that buy and sell things down a supply chain, there's also these different actors that that play a role, and NGOs are one of those. And in this particular project, we were looking at what made NGOs effective partners to companies in trying to tackle these type of abuses. So it was fascinating for me to kind of look at this industry of phishing, but also these different kinds of industry dynamics that happen. And so business NGO relations in Thailand can be quite different to some other countries because of the kind of the institutional environment in which they're operating, where, you know, there's less perhaps freedoms that NGOs might have compared to some other countries, and there's less opportunity for them to engage sometimes in some of the more typical NGO practices of naming and shaming companies as an approach to get them to change. So more working with corporations, and what does it take to work with a corporation in tackling these problems? And so we try to identify some of the characteristics, some of the sources of power of NGOs and, you know, non-profit organizations that made their interventions with companies more effective in reducing forced labor.
Wow, I see this segue of the conversation hanging there like a ripe fruit, so I will take it and move our conversation there and ask the question then. So what is working and how? Like, who are these social intermediaries working in and around the Thai fishing industry? What are they doing? What's working? What's not working?
Well, first of all, there are many, right? And I think that's an outflow of the whole media attention that the Thai case received. And again, also coming back to your earlier question, the good thing was that there was a lot of money available all of a sudden. There were a lot of donors that were willing to give money to that cause, and that attracted a lot of NGOs. And a lot of these NGOs, particularly the global ones, they weren't even familiar with the context of Thailand. They weren't even familiar with the context of, they weren't even labor NGOs. They were maybe more active in the environmental domain, or they were active in sex and child trafficking, right? So they weren't like necessarily experts on this particular topic, but there were a lot of NGOs in that field. So we looked at all of them, and I think we also talked to all of them, but ultimately we decided to focus on those that were local, that have been around for longer, and that have managed to build trust with the migrant communities in Thailand, particularly with Burmese workers, which are the biggest migrant community in Thailand and also the biggest migrant community in fishing. And one thing you have to know about the migrant community is they don't build trust easily. They don't trust others easily. Particularly, they don't trust organizations, they trust people. And even that takes a long time. So that's why we found it important, or what we noticed is that it is important to focus on these local NGOs. These were often migrant worker organizations or just regular NGOs, but they were not advocacy NGOs. That's maybe also important to highlight. So they weren't writing reports trying to name and shame companies or the Thai government. They were operating more silently.
And I think for me, and some of the kind of fascinating things that we found in that respect, I mean, the work that I've done before looking at business and NGO partnerships, you often get this kind of idea this finding that NGOs need to be very business friendly if they're going to be working with companies. But we actually found that the most successful interventions were actually with NGOs that had more of their legitimacy with the migrant worker community than with other companies. And in fact, the NGOs that were supported by and working a lot with other companies kind of were less successful because they didn't have the same kind of embeddedness, the same kind of referent power that the NGOs that had a good reputation with other embedded NGOs and bodies established around this issue were. Similarly, the kind of expert knowledge that they needed. But these were all expert kind of NGOs. And typically you think the ones that have the broader knowledge, the ones that are kind of international NGOs that have a kind of deep knowledge about the broader institutions are often the ones that companies like to partner with. But in this case, It was really ones that had very specific contextual knowledge that were the ones that managed to engage in the more successful interventions with companies.
It's interesting. It almost sounds as if you have different forms of power or different forms of legitimacy, or depending upon who you're more used to speaking with and who you're not.
Exactly. It's almost as if you've read our paper, Ian. I mean, there are these... They're very
I read it
much
2 weeks.
these...
I read it 2 weeks ago. So
well, you obviously still remember. I'm impressed. Go ahead, Miriam.
We do distinguish between different forms of power, but these are like more academic terms, so maybe we don't want to like bore you with these terms. But yes, I think this is a very accurate summary of, I think, our main findings. But if I can add to that, so I think this context knowledge, that's very important, right? So we mentioned the legitimacy with the migrant workers, that this is very important. And depending on the migrant worker groups, they're also different. They have different needs. And it requires, of course, obviously different language skills and contextual skills to connect with each migrant worker group. But also the knowledge on the context of fishing was important. So we talked about it earlier that work in fishing is very specific. It differs from work in other settings like manufacturing or construction. So those NGOs that understood this context, they were also more respected by the workers themselves, but also trusted by the companies to really be able to help formulate better standards and also help with effective auditing of working conditions. So I think that's maybe another thing I want to highlight there. And the other aspect is about maybe the problem of scaling up. Like Andy said, it's for companies, it might be easier to work with a global NGO that already speaks your language or speaks the language of business, but you really need to invest time and effort to work with these local NGOs that have these very narrow expertise, and that at the same time can make it also challenging maybe to look for these turnkey solutions, right? Like a lot of companies are doing right now. They're looking for worker voice apps that they can install or give to all their suppliers all around the globe, or they're looking for whistleblowing platforms that are operated by NGOs. And, so these scalable solutions, and particularly those based on technologies, are difficult because, they're often not very good in establishing trust, particularly from vulnerable worker groups.
Yeah, I don't think I trust these things in any workplace I've worked in either. Like, even when you get these surveys from the admin at a university, you're like, is this really anonymous? Like can I really trust them? And even, and I'm not I am a migrant worker, but I'm not a vulnerable migrant worker necessarily, but I still feel a bit worried about doing it. But I'm also interested to know whether it's possible for these social intermediaries, as you term them, to be successful in both settings. With these, grassroots NGOs, the guys who can, go sit in the bar with the migrant laborers, get to know them, get to really find out about their issues. Can they then go sit in the office of the big businesses and convince them about their findings? Is there some tension there between the two?
That's what they're doing, but definitely there are tensions, right? So those NGOs that we observed, they were trying to do both. So they were very connected with the migrant worker community. At the same time, they did understand, and that was new for them. We actually wrote another paper. So Aline and I wrote another paper on this, but this was a new role for many of them, working with businesses. And not everybody was on board with this, right? So there were also lots of discussion that we observed within each of these organizations, because there were a lot of members that didn't feel comfortable with this new role. But I think a lot of them also understood that this was a way, because it was so difficult to convince the Thai government to make certain changes, that this was a way to achieve improvements for vulnerable workers. So I think there was definitely a kind of pragmatic shift to work more with companies. But Definitely, there were a lot of situations where these NGOs felt uncomfortable, or these social intermediaries felt uncomfortable. Some felt abused for greenwashing purposes when they were invited to meetings. And this was just a photo session, basically, with managers from seafood corporations. And there was no discussion going on before that. So I think some of them also had to learn how to work with these businesses.
Yeah, and I think that just adding to that is, we need to think about the NGO community as a kind of ecosystem of different NGOs, some with more specialist contextual knowledge, some with more general or business-friendly kind of approaches. And you need them all to some extent, right? And they all play a different role. And they're all aware of each other and the different kind of places that they inhabit in this ecosystem. And the question often for companies looking to solve these problems is, which are the right NGOs to actually work with to systematically address these more systemic kind of problems if you're serious about it? And often that requires more of a portfolio approach, if you like, right? It's not just one NGO that you maybe work with and that's going to solve all your problems, because there's a lot of different problems going on here, right? There's a lot of different causes. There's a lot of different symptoms at the other end. And so if you're serious about tackling these problems, it requires these more systemic responses.
Does it need buy-in from the businesses themselves? I mean, the cynic might say, okay, there's probably some companies with really good intentions, and they're like, okay, you know what, guys, we realize let's partner with a few different organizations and so on. But I imagine, as you're sort of hinting at, there are other possibilities of sort of bringing someone on board, having the photo op, and then carrying on business as usual. So I guess the question that my cynical part of my mind says, okay, these good examples can be used as a way of basically masking the continued business as usual, where there might be forced labor, there might be terrible working conditions anyway, and these one or two good cases almost allow for the system to continue.
Yeah, I think there's the fundamental question you always have to ask companies is, do you want to manage your reputation or do you want to solve the problem? Right? Because you can manage your reputation by doing a range of different things. And sometimes that might even involve like removing certain suppliers from your supply chain because they're a high-risk supplier for forced labor. But that doesn't solve the problem, right? That doesn't stop the forced labor. It requires these more fundamental approaches. A good example would be in Uzbekistan with the cotton industry, for example. For decades, we've known that there's been forced labor in kind of cotton harvesting in Uzbekistan, and that cotton has found itself into kind of global markets for cotton, which then end up in the clothes that we wear. And again, more than 10 years ago, a bunch of companies got together with an NGO to develop a pledge to not source any cotton from Uzbekistan as a result of this. And it required, lots of major companies, like Zara and H&M and others to be involved in this. And if you have enough concerted power together of companies like that, it can gradually make a difference. Now, it took over 10 years for Uzbekistan to gradually switch its practices to removing forced labor. It started off by removing child labor, then it removed forced labor, and then it said it removed forced labor, but then it didn't allow inspections, and so gradually it allowed inspections from the UN as well. And so eventually, with enough concerted kind of power from a whole range of different retailers, we gradually had a very positive effect.
I am still interested in how you go about researching. Let's think specifically about this Thai fishing industry. How are you getting data? Because I think for a lot of people, they probably have, if they're not researchers themselves, they probably have no idea how you find out what you find out.
Yeah, so when we started this research project, we were a team of researchers from Australia, and I was here in Europe. And it was really easy to to get interviews, to get interviewees to accept our invitation to talk to us. And that surprised us. But after a while, we discovered, or we reflected on it, and we're like, oh my gosh, we're only talking to all those global NGOs. And we were talking to Greenpeace, and we were talking to Environmental Justice Foundation. So we were talking to all these global NGOs. And it is much harder to talk to local NGOs, and it's even harder to talk to workers, of course, right? And that's because of language barriers, but also trust issues and access problem in general. So that's how I met Aline, basically. I think you need to, for these type of research, you need to have at least you need to have a researcher that is connected, that has networks. I mean, Aline is Thai, so she doesn't speak Burmese either, right? But she was very, she spent a lot of time there. She did field research there. And so she built a network of local research assistants or local researchers at partner universities. And that helped us to get access to these organizations, but also to the workers, and to actually conduct these interviews. So you have to work with research assistants. We had a very, very capable and skilled research assistant that was actually Burmese himself, and that was living in one of the ports and was really good in managing to interview workers.
Yeah, I think just adding to that, I mean, I've done projects in a number of different countries and industries, and it's absolutely essential that you have these locally embedded researchers. Otherwise, the kinds of insights that you get are just hardly worth the paper they're written on or the tape they're recorded on, right?
It's really interesting. It's almost as if a good methodology for doing research also has to, it mirrors in some ways the successful interventions by social intermediaries in the Thai fishing industry, right? You need a combination of a global perspective together with embedded, trusted individuals on the ground as well. It's really fascinating. The methodology and the findings mirror each other in some way there. But I'm going to ask one last cheeky question that came to mind as I was listening to you then. Last episode, I spoke with Melissa Markshe and with Peter van der Geest, and they were quite adamant that it can become almost a problem to talk about forced labor and slavery in this sort of industry, because they suggest that this just scares people off a lot. And it's difficult to then work with some of the representatives from business, but also when there's such high level of illegality going on, it can become very hard then to affect change. They rather say we should think about it in terms of labor rights. How would you respond to that? Because we've been talking a lot today about forced labor. How would you respond to that critique?
I mean, I would tend to agree, particularly, well, it depends which context we're talking about. So when we're talking to workers, using the language of forced labor and modern slavery doesn't help anything, really. You're talking about specific labor rights or specific experiences of the working environment that you can document. And so when you're then documenting those practices, you may then analyze them and then associate it with practices of forced labor, modern slavery. And then with NGOs, it can be useful depending on how they frame themselves. So if you're talking with NGOs that are particularly focused on forced labor or trafficking, then obviously it's a way of connecting with them. With others that are much more focused on labor rights, they may be more suspicious in different ways. So it really depends. And then with companies, again, there's a difference. So I've had experiences with other projects where we certainly don't ever mention that we're doing research on modern slavery. This is a terrible idea generally because no one wants to talk to you. But you're talking about human resource issues, labor conditions, these kind of things. But when it comes up, if it comes up, or if your findings start coming out where you're talking about these things and you're looking for change, so you want to engage with different actors like companies when you have findings, then you have to manage these situations quite cautiously.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think particularly modern slavery is such an emotionally charged term that it's very effective in terms of getting attention, getting media attention, even for us academics. But I also would be very, very careful. That's why I think a lot of us in our community, we have stopped using the word modern slavery and we're talking forced labor. But even, forced labor can even be a red flag term as well. I think businesses, they prefer to talk of business human rights. So maybe that could be a workaround, that if you want to interview companies about these practices, that you talk of business human rights.
Brilliant. I've really enjoyed our conversation, but I think our time together is coming to an end. So I'd like to thank you both, Miriam and Andrew, for taking your time today to talk with us on Fishy Work.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Ian.
And now we reach the final part of the show where we speak with our not in the net, Alin Kadvak. Hi, Alin. How are you doing on this glorious day?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Beautiful sunny day in Uppsala.
Wow. I don't know if there's many beautiful sunny days in Uppsala, but let's imagine there is.
Hello. Yes, it's beautiful. It is sunny. It is sunny outside.
It is sunny. Great. So you've just had a listen to the discussion between Miriam, Andrew, and myself. So first up, I was wondering, what are the key points that you think are really interesting that we should take away from that discussion?
No, I think it's super interesting when Miriam and Andrew talk about the connections between global supply chains and what actually happened in Thailand. The concrete example of what they trying to do and we trying to do, I mean, I was part of that research, is try to connect the global supply chains and the impact of those global scandals to what happened at the local level, what happened to the workers on the ground. And the terminology that we use in this paper is social intermediary, which is a front runner NGO who work with the fish worker, mostly migrant fish worker on different harbor in Thailand. And we try to understand how they understand the context of migrant fish worker, which is fascinating. And a lot of companies actually starting to work with this frontline NGO. So I think the one take-home message is the scale, the connections between global and the local context.
Great. And why is it important? Why is it important for people to think about scale and social intermediaries and the global supply chain?
I mean, if, the global scandal have bring attentions to a specific case, if nothing have been done at the local level, it doesn't mean anything for the fish worker, for the workers themselves, right? So I think it is important for us to try to understand what the connections, how the company could potentially make change at a local level. So I think that's kind of a very interesting point of what Andrew and Miriam have tried to do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alin. I'm looking forward to checking in with you again in a month's time.
No, we're going to continue talking, are we? Are we done?
I thought you wanted it short and sweet. I'll have you two questions for you. What else do you want?
Yes, but I want to also introduce a next episode. I've been
I'm sorry.
Preparing.
I'm sorry. This is news for me as well. I don't know what the next episode is, so this is surprising. Tell me. Drum roll.
Yes. The second point, kind of like a connection to what Andrew and Miriam already mentioned, is that, we want to kind of give a teaser. What do you call it, teaser? I want to give you what we might bring for the next episode. So the next episode, we would like to discuss the migrant workers agents and the agencies and how they can actually drive for change. And we have two the speaker coming up. One will actually gonna take you to karaoke rooms in the fishing boat outside of Trinidad and Tobago. So one of the speaker will talk about the Vietnamese migrant fish worker and try to plan to escape the very cruel captain from the fishing boat. And the second one is the researcher who working on the Adivasi fish worker from Goa.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. I'm really looking forward to that. And so it is a real tease. I am really excited. I hope you are actually sending me to Trinidad and Tobago. I hope that there's the budget in the podcast for that.
Let's see. Let's hope for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Aline. And this really is the end this time, not the false ending. I hope everybody is suitably teased. Looking forward to the next episode. So until then, goodbye.
Bye.
Fishy Work is part of the Just Seafood project, a collaboration between the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Sweden, the University of Ottawa in Canada, the Institute of Social Sciences of the Central Region, Vietnam, and the Cambodia Development Resource Institute in Cambodia. It's funded by the Swedish Research Council for Sustainable Development, FORMAS, and the Swedish Research Council, VR. The project's principal investigator is Dr. Aline Kadvak, and I've been your host, Ian M. Cook. Ta-da! If you would like to get in touch, and we really hope you do, then please go to justseafood.org. That is JUSTSEAFOOD.org, and you can find all of our details there. And not only that, you can also find much more information and research relating to the topic, and you can also find full transcripts of the podcast episodes. Finally, everybody says it in podcast, and everybody says it because it's true, that please do leave ratings and reviews if you are so inclined, because it really does help more people find out about the show.